In the early 1990s, long before the iPhone or Android, an odd little processor with a storybook name quietly tried to invent mobile computing. It was called the Hobbit, built not by a PC giant, but by AT&T. For a brief moment, this obscure chip sat at the heart of ambitious pen-based tablets and early smart communicators. Then, almost as quickly as it appeared, it vanished, taking with it a very different vision of how personal computing might have evolved. This is the story of the AT&T Hobbit, a forgotten experiment that came surprisingly close to powering a handheld revolution that arrived more than a decade later, on completely different silicon. To understand the Hobbit, you have to go back to Bell Labs and AT&T in the mid-1980s. AT&T had just been broken up, but it still controlled a massive research empire and wanted to move beyond being just a telephone company. Bell Labs researchers had been exploring an idea called the C machine, a processor designed specifically to execute the C programming language efficiently, instead of inheriting decades of design baggage from earlier instruction sets. The motivation was simple. Most system software was being written in C, so why not build hardware that matched how C actually worked? Rather than chasing the mainstream microprocessor market dominated by Intel's x86 and Motorola's 68000, AT&T's Computer Systems division backed this research into a specialized architecture for compact high-level language code. Out of that work, in the late 1980s, the Hobbit microprocessor design began to take shape. Technically, the Hobbit was an oddball. While industry marketing talked about RISC versus CISC, Hobbit followed a different path, a compact, stack-oriented architecture derived from the C machine work. It used relatively few general-purpose registers and leaned heavily on a memory-based stack for operations, aligning closely with how C compilers structured function calls and local variables. The chip was built for small size and low power rather than raw benchmark speed. It was intended to sit in battery-powered handheld devices, not blazing fast desktop workstations. Compared with contemporaries like Motorola's 68000 or Intel's 386, which were aimed at general-purpose PCs and workstations, Hobbit traded away peak performance for simpler decoding, denser code, and efficient execution of compiled C programs. On paper, that made it an appealing candidate for portable, pen-driven computers that needed to sip power while running relatively complex software. Hobbit's big opportunity arrived with the first wave of pen computing in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Silicon Valley startup Geo Corporation, founded by Jerry Kaplan in 1987, was building an operating system called PenPoint, designed from the ground up for stylus input and portable tablets. Go needed a low-power, reasonably capable CPU that could fit inside thin battery-operated pen computers. AT&T, hungry for a role in the emerging mobile computing market, pitched the Hobbit as that foundation. Hobbit became one of the key hardware platforms for PenPoint-based tablets, including devices sold under AT&T's own EO brand. At the same time, AT&T's technology also found its way, in modified form, into early smartphone precursors, such as the IBM Simon Personal Communicator, marketed with Bell South in the mid-1990s. In this ecosystem, Hobbit was supposed to be the quiet workhorse, a customized brain for a new class of pen and phone hybrids that didn't look anything like desktop PCs. Behind these devices were overlapping ambitions and very different cultures. AT&T's leadership saw computing and consumer electronics as a way to diversify beyond regulated telephony. Spinning up EO Incorporated as a subsidiary let AT&T package hardware wireless connectivity and its network services into an all-in-one personal communicator aimed at mobile professionals. Meanwhile, Go Corporation's Jerry Kaplan, along with colleagues like Robert Carr, imagined a future in which people wrote directly on the screen instead of using keyboards. PenPoint tried to rethink the interface around notebooks, gestures, and handwriting. For Go, Hobbit was a strategic partner choice. AT&T could provide funding, manufacturing muscle, and a custom chip tuned to Go's software. For AT&T, Go and EO offered a path into an emerging market that might one day rival the telephone in importance. On paper, it looked like a powerful alliance. Once real devices shipped, the weaknesses of the Hobbit strategy became harder to ignore. Although the architecture had been tuned for C code, actual systems weren't dramatically faster or more efficient than competitors built on more conventional processors. In some workloads, Hobbit's stack-oriented approach and limited registers turned into overhead. The chips were not especially cheap, and complete pen systems ended up expensive compared with laptops. At the same time, the software stack wasn't ready. PenPoint was ambitious but complex, and handwriting recognition of the era was often inaccurate and slow. Early EO communicators and PenPoint tablets consumed more power in real-world use than marketing promised, leading to disappointing battery life. While exact performance and cost figures are hard to reconstruct and often disputed by those who worked on the projects, the consensus is that Harvest-based systems failed to deliver a clear, compelling advantage over more conventional hardware running cut-down versions of desktop operating systems. While AT&T and Go were struggling to refine their products, the competitive landscape shifted quickly. Microsoft pushed Windows for pen computing, layering stylus support onto the familiar Windows environment and making life easier for PC vendors who preferred standard x86 chips. Apple, meanwhile, launched the Newton in 1993, built around an ARM processor that would quietly become the template for later low-power mobile CPUs. Hobbit found itself squeezed. It lacked the software ecosystem of x86 and the clean, scalable, low-power design trajectory of ARM. Inside AT&T, enthusiasm for being a chip and device company reportedly began to cool as costs mounted and sales disappointed. Public documentation is thin on the internal politics, but former employees have described shifting priorities, reorganizations, and a sense that Hobbit and EO were no longer strategic crown jewels, but experimental side bets. In that atmosphere, long-term investment became harder to justify. By around 1994, AT&T pulled the plug on further Hobbit development. Without its bespoke processor and the backing of a major carrier, EO Incorporated could not survive. It shut down, and remaining inventory was written off. Go Corporation, already struggling to win hardware partners and developer support, also collapsed not long after. The early 1990s pen computing wave broke, leaving behind a small graveyard of specialized chips, operating systems, and devices that had tried to skip directly to mobile computing before the broader ecosystem was ready. Exact sales numbers for Hobbit-based systems are hard to pin down. Surviving accounts suggest they were tiny compared to mainstream PCs or even to Apple's Newton. What is clear is that by the mid-1990s, Hobbit had disappeared from product roadmaps, and AT&T's brief experiment as a niche microprocessor vendor was over. Today, the AT&T Hobbit lives on mainly as a curiosity for retro computing fans and historians of pen computing. A handful of EO communicators and development boards sit in private collections and museums, their unusual stack-based chips a reminder of a very different approach to system design. In terms of direct technical influence, Hobbit's impact appears limited. The mainstream mobile world instead coalesced around ARM, whose low-power RISC designs ended up in everything from early PDAs to modern smartphones. Still, the concerns that drove the C Machine and Hobbit projects, efficient execution of high-level languages, compact code, low power, resurfaced in later work on just-in-time compilation, embedded processors, and energy-aware CPU design. Any claim that Hobbit directly shaped those trends would be overstated, but it sat within a broader shift in thinking that small battery-powered computers deserved architectures tailored to their needs, not just cut-down desktop chips. Looking back, the Hobbit story reads like a parable about good ideas that arrived too early in the wrong institutional home. Bell Labs engineers and AT&T executives glimpsed a world of handheld, networked communicators and stylus-driven tablets long before those categories became mainstream. Go Corporation's software vision, EO's devices, and AT&T's custom chip all pointed toward a future that did eventually materialize, only with different companies, different operating systems, and different silicon. In the end, The Hobbit is a reminder that technological history is full of near misses, architectures and products that nearly fit the moment, but not quite. A small, power-conscious processor with a whimsical name tried to help invent mobile computing in the early 1990s, and failed. More than a decade later, when smartphones and tablets finally took off in earnest, the world rarely looked back to notice that AT&T's unlikely little chip had once tried to lead the way.